So John asked me to come in such a physical sense, talk with you guys about kind of the post-residency regulatory system. So like licensure and hospital credentialing and boards and all that. So that's what I'm talking about. With that, R1s, if you are welcome to stay if you're interested, but this is not immediately relevant to you. So you are also welcome to go get some exercise or whatever it is you need to do. R2s and R3s in particular, you are really the target audience. And then R2s, totally would love to have you. The more people there are, the more questions there are that get asked. And this is one that really benefits from Q&A. So with that said, the other thing I'm gonna ask you guys to do is please turn on your video if you're wearing clothes. It helps me to feel like I'm talking to people rather than a stupid little webcam. And I also want to know exactly how much my MacBook Air can take in terms of video sharing. All right, so here we go. Can someone please confirm you are looking at the slides, right? I'm sharing the correct screen. Good, okay. Here we go. So I want to kind of introduce this with just a little story about this guy. His name is Mike. He was born in Tacoma. He grew up in Illinois. Maddie just turned her thing on. Nothing about Illinois here. He was a Marine. He got an honorable discharge from the U.S. Marine Corps. He went to med school at Southern Illinois University, and he actually has just started his internship at Ohio State. So totally nice guy, kind of a little weird around the edges, but who isn't? Does anybody recognize him? John's nodding. Anyone else? So this is who we're talking about. This is Michael Swango. He has been called by many Dr. Death. At his hospital noticed that there seemed to be an unusual number of people who were dying while he was on service. What's interesting and I guess somewhat disappointing is that his residency offer, he was going to be a neurosurgeon, and they actually withdrew that offer not because of his body count, but because he was also kind of a jerk. So he did not get his residency. He actually went back to his home in Quincy, Illinois, and became an EMT. And then his fellow paramedics started noticing that whenever he brought lunch, they were getting sick. So someone actually took the lunch into the state crime lab. They found arsenic in the lunch that he brought in, and he was actually convicted of aggravated battery for poisoning his colleagues. Where the story gets gnarly is after this felony conviction, he managed to go on and do several years of residency in South Dakota with multiple patients dying. And then went on to be a psych resident at SUNY Stony Brook after that. And that was even after the AMA had sent a letter to every residency program in the country saying, watch out for this guy, he's bad news. So he finally, while he was a resident at SUNY Stony Brook, he was convicted of a relatively minor charge that put him in jail for about 1.5 years. That allowed the FBI to assemble a case against him. He admitted to 3 murders. They estimate that he probably killed between 35 and 60 people in his career. So why do I say this? And the reason that I say this is from the perspective of a regulatory body, you are this guy until proven otherwise. So what they want to know is that you are not Michael Swango. And that is why when you've already all applied for a Washington State license, you're familiar with the paperwork. Every time you apply for licenses or privileges anywhere, they're going to make you provide them the information that allows them to do due diligence to make sure that you aren't Michael Swango. They also are going to take some time to do that. So if there's only one thing that you take home, I have a list of take-home points at the end, but if there's one thing that you take home from this, it is whatever privileges you need, apply early, because it's going to take a while. Okay, enough of Mike Swango. Here's the talk. I want to do an overview, kind of just an overview of how the regulatory framework is supposed to work. Talk a little bit about the authority that is in the hands of the states, which is largely licensure, continuing medical education. Disciplinary action, I'm not going to actually talk about specifically. That's kind of a talk of its own, but that is also part of states' authority. Hospitals, they have the authority to credential and privilege you at their hospital and also withdraw those privileges. Again, more disciplinary action. We're not going there yet. and then talk a little bit about specialty boards, which is probably on many of the R3's minds because you have things to look forward to this August. Then we should have some time for Q&A. I made the talk pretty short relative to the time slot, so we'll see how we do. Okay, so now my one Zoom poll, and I'm gonna see if I can get it going. Here we go, we're hitting the launch poll button. The question is, select all of the following that you need to practice medicine as a physician in the US. Do you need a degree that allows you to do that, like an MD or a DO or an MBBS or something like that? Do you need a valid license? Do you need to have finished residency? Do you need to have hospital privileges? Do you need to have a board a certificate from a specialty board? All right, so far it's coming in. We probably already have a representative sample. There are 94% of you think you need an MD and a state license, and those are largely true. There's a loophole in that if you're practicing at a federal facility, you definitely need the degree. There's no loophole on the degree as far as I know. If you're practicing at a federal facility like IHS or the VA, you can actually practice temporarily without having a license in the state in which that facility is located, but they expect you to get one within a reasonable time frame. So by and large, A and B are 100% true. You need to have a license and you need to have a degree. 47% of you said accredited residency program. That is largely wrong. There is a minority of states like Montana that require you to have completed a residency. The majority of states require only 1 or 2 years of postgraduate training. It's about 40% 1 year, 60% 2 years, all subject to change without notice. Only 16% of you said hospital privileges. That is correct in the sense that you do not need to be privileged at a hospital. 21% of you said board certification. By and large, that is, you do not need to have board certification. There's only 1 or 2 states that require boards for licensure. Again, Montana is one of those. Montana's got a really interesting licensure system. So good job, team. But that doesn't mean that you're wasting your time in residency. But as those of you who are R3s and moonlighting know, you can go out and practice for money with a full license and nothing from your residency program other than occasionally our good wishes. So schematically, this is how I think of it. The state, the hospital, and the subspecialty boards are all communicating with each other to some degree, and that communication was dramatically improved by stories like Michael Swango's. So there is now much more effort for these organizations to talk to one another. And the public is kind of in the middle there, theoretically protected by all these organizations. So let's start with state authority. So hopefully all of you have applied for some kind of license. I'm imagining most of the R3s already have a full license by now. What do you need for licensure in most states? Well, you need to have that MD or DO or whatever degree. And like I was saying, you need for most states 1 or 2 years of postgraduate training to get a license. And then they do a background check. And this varies somewhat from state to state, but they're all looking for pretty much the same things. Evidence of impairment. So do you have substance use disorders, mental health disorders, other issues that are going to impair your ability to practice? Have you ever had a license or hospital privileges revoked? That's always a red flag. Have you had other disciplinary actions against you? So have other state boards, for example, limited your license, restricted your license in some way? Do you have a criminal history? That usually means felonies. And the other thing they often ask is, do you have malpractice claims against you? Malpractice claims are not a deal breaker. About 1/3 of physicians end up having a suit filed against them at some point or another. But any of these things, if any of these check boxes get checked, it's going to delay you getting a license while they investigate that further. The only one that is typically a showstopper is a felony conviction. Everything else, usually the board will evaluate and look at what the circumstances were. The other thing I just wanted to bring up in the setting of initial licensure, the Federation of State Medical Boards, which most of you are familiar with because that's who you register for step 3, have a couple of services that are worth noting. One is that they developed this uniform application. That application is accepted by many states. If you are applying in another state, and I know that some of you are going elsewhere for practice or for fellowship, if they give you the option to do the uniform application, do it, because if you decide to move elsewhere later, you can reuse that same application or you can update it. So the uniform application is a plus and it's free. The more expensive service that they offer, which is not going to be useful for most of you, but is still worth knowing about, is this thing called the credentials verification service. Basically what that is a very expensive file folder for all the things that you need to apply, that you need in order to apply for licensure. So some of you who have applied for licenses in whammy states realize that you have to get like a verified copy of your medical school diploma, blah, 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 blah. And that's a lot of work. So what FSMB does is for 400 bucks, they will collect all of that information for you and they will send it to one state board. If you want them to do that again later, it's an additional 100 bucks. If you want them to do that to multiple states at once, it is the fee plus 65 per state. The nice thing about this, all states accept it. So if you are planning on practicing in multiple states, like if you're looking at a locum tenens career, or if you are doing your fellowship somewhere that you don't plan to end up, this may be worth doing. It's particularly worth doing if you're planning on practicing in one of these states, because these states actually require that you use the CVS. Most other states will accept it, but they don't require it. And generally, if you're planning on settling down somewhere, it's not worth the money if the state doesn't require it. But if you're planning on being mobile, this service can actually save you a lot of time and energy. Megan is asking what I mean by medicine slash. All right, I'll deal with questions in a minute. The other thing that I want you to be aware of, which is actually kind of a cool newish thing, not immediately relevant to you because you actually have to be board certified to participate, but will be relevant soon, is something called the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact. If you hold a full license in one of these dark blue states and you are board certified and you have no disciplinary actions against your license, there is an expedited process to get licensed in any other dark blue state. The light blue states are currently in the process of joining the compact. They have legislation pending. New York State signed up for the compact in February 2020, no surprise there. The purple states have some, their things are kind of like on pause. So basically just pay attention to the dark blue states. And if you are going to one of those states, this is gonna be a good resource for you once you're board certified. Okay, the other big domain of state jurisdiction is continuing medical education. Continuing medical education is loathed by most physicians. It is an administrative nightmare. And it's a good thing in principle and an annoying thing in practice. So the bottom line is that most state medical boards require you to do something to stay smart after you graduate. There actually are exceptions. If you're going to Colorado, Montana, or South Dakota, they don't currently have CME requirements. I don't expect they will in the near future, but these obviously are subject to change without notice. And that's another thing that really annoys doctors, is that these CME requirements are they're usually determined by the legislature. So there will occasionally be like initiatives on the ballot to add something that every doctor has to learn. The requirements vary pretty widely. Typically in states that require CME, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 50 hours of additional education per year. Some fraction of this, that up to 100%, but usually less than that, has to be what they call Category 1 CME, and that basically just means it's been accredited by the American College of Continuing Medical or American Council of Continuing Medical Education. So that's going to be most meetings. It's going to be many, many other resources like UpToDate. CME is accredited. So that's most of the things you think of as CME. There are other categories, like Category 3 is teaching. So you can do teaching and apply for CME. You can do self-study and apply for CME. But the money, the currency for the boards is usually Category 1. Specific earmarks are incredibly common. That comes back to that legislative thing that I was talking about. Many states have an earmark for opioid training that you have to do a certain number of hours of that. Many have HIV. In Washington State, 1 year, 2 years ago, they added a 6-hour requirement for suicide prevention training. So some states, there's just a laundry list of specific topics. Just know what you're getting into when you were applying for a license in that state. Usually those are one-time requirements. If you've done it for good. There are a few where you have to do updates in specific topic areas. One big thing that's a good thing to know and worth looking into, some states, including Washington, actually accept participation in a maintenance of certification program in lieu of CME. If you are practicing in a state like that, that is a huge thing, because if you're going to be an MOC anyway, and I will make the case that you should, then you don't have to worry about CME for that state. It might still be to your benefit to track CME just in case the law changes or in case you move and people want to know what your CME history was. but you don't have to report it. So just in terms of what are we doing for those of you who are going to still be here in Washington next year, you have to do one of the following. You either have to do 200 hours of CME every 4 years, or you have to have been board certified within the preceding 4 years. So all of you residents can stop paying attention right now. You're covered for the next 4 years after your initial board certification. But if you're thinking beyond that, you can also be participating in MOC, that meets the requirement, or if you're participating in an ACGME accredited training program. So those of you who are going to be doing fellowships here in Washington State, don't worry about CME, you're good. You also have to do, these are the one-off earmarks for Washington State, 6 hours of suicide, 1 hour of opioids, and 4 hours of HIV. Hopefully most of you have already done those. So bottom line on CME. So I want to acknowledge that actually a lot of you are scholars, a lot of you are going to be teaching at CME conferences from this day forward. I will not be the least surprised if I go to National ACP and see some of you guys talking there. That said, the whole CME enterprise is inherently dodgy. So what do I mean by that? CME is largely funded by industry. We feel like we're paying a lot to go to these conferences. We are paying less than half and frequently less than 20% of what it actually costs to put on the conference. And the other 50 to 80% typically comes from pharma or device makers or various other industries that are helping fund it. What does that mean? Basically, what they are doing is they are commodifying your time and attention. All of these industries are paying in order to get their hands on your ears, typically in the big exhibit hall. If you've ever been to any of these meetings, there's always a giant hall and it's full of commercial enterprise stuff. They obviously aren't stupid and they realize that the content of the meeting may also help to support their products. The accreditation process tries to bar that. I don't know how many of you have been to even our local ACP meeting and you'll see there's a lot of questions about commercial bias, but it's just inherently dodgy. Another thing about CME, the requirements vary quite a bit from state to state. So wherever you hold your license, just know what those requirements are. Do take advantage of free CME. By far the biggest source for most of us is if you have an individual registration for UpToDate, regardless of whether you're paying for it or the institution is, if you're logged in as yourself. So here at the University of Washington, that means either if you're on a mobile device, if you have manually logged in on a web browser, or if you have gone to UpToDate by clicking the button in Epic, then UpToDate is tracking your use. And for every card you look at, it gives you 1/2 hour of CME credit. And the same is true for MOC points. So that's basically all free CME if you're not paying for your UpToDate subscription. If you're paying for your UpToDate subscription, it's free as part of the subscription. Dynamed does the same thing. There's also professional meetings you were going to go to anyway. So for me, that's the Society of General Internal Medicine meeting or APDIM or ACP. They all offer CME that I paid for the meeting, but I don't have to pay more for the CME. So if you have the option of getting CME or MOC points for something that you paid, that you already paid for, take it. The corollary to that is don't waste money on CME courses unless you were going to do them anyway. Especially if you're in a state where if you're in a state where they're awarding CME credit for MOC, don't waste your money on this stuff. It's just not worth it. And then the final bottom line is for states where you do have to report CME, the general theme is that it is a self-report system where they have the option of auditing you and saying, please show us the paperwork. So you need a system in order to keep track of this. I actually use Evernote. I just scan the receipts into Evernote and then kind of use that as a way of storing things. But whatever your filing system is, whether it's paper or some kind of paperless app, start recording these CME receipts. It's actually, you usually have to submit for CME at the end of the meeting, but it's really easy. It's like a one-page form basically saying that you were there and it was free of commercial bias. I wanted to do a brief sidebar on how do I stay current, because you may have caught my theme that staying current is not CME. So I think probably the most important thing for most of us, particularly generalists who never know enough to actually do our job, is point of care resources. So for me, that's UpToDate because it's easy. Dynamed's also a great resource. I like UpToDate because I like the prose style. If you're more into bullet points, I think Dynamed is actually a little bit better product from an evidence-based point of view. Both of those have CME and MOC if you are logged in as an individual. The other way that I think a lot of us stay current is to participate in a group practice. Now, you don't get CME points for asking people questions, but you do get smarter. So, you know, hang with people who know more than you do. I recommend having their phone number. I hate pagers, but people tend to reply to text messages and emails pretty quickly if they know you need help. The other options that are out there that I think are worth knowing about, things like newsletters and journal aggregators. So ACP Journal Club, Journal Watch, the medical letter, the prescriber's letter, these are all things that will show up in your email, you know, anywhere from every day to every few weeks, depending on your settings, and will tell you things that are like new information that you need to know. I don't pay for Journal Watch because my ACP membership gets me into ACP Journal Club. I do get the medical letter because I'm giving this talk every year at ACP on new drugs, and I find that to be a great resource. But these are nice things. And then the other thing that's free that you can do is table of contents emails. The thing that I really want to emphasize to all you guys is very few people in clinical practice spend a ton of time looking at primary sources. Now, those of you who are going to be doing a ton of research, doing fellowships, maybe you'll have time for that. But I don't think you need to feel guilty as a practitioner for not reading the Annals and New England Journal table of contents every week. Nobody does that. So if it's your thing and you want to do that, great. These are good resources. If you do if you do a lot of reading, the thing that I would encourage you to do is to develop some way of keeping track of the articles that you've read. Most people use citation managers of some kind for this. Mendeley is free. ReadCube is what I use because I got into it many years ago. EndNote also works. But this is really helpful because at least then if it's going through your brain, I saw this paper on topic X. You can go back to that aggregator there, to that source tracker and be like, okay, where's the paper that I saw on topic X? So please, if you are taking the time to read papers, find a way to store them because the actual paper itself will leave your brain, but the take-home point won't. John is talking about negotiating job contracts. Oh man, you're so over my head. Okay, moving on. From Alice. Basically every state medical board will have a web page. If you need to, you can actually go to the FSMB website. I think it's fsmb.org, and they actually have a directory of state medical boards, but you can also just Google Washington State Medical Board, Montana State Medical Board. CME requirements will usually be on that web page. What's interesting is the states that don't have CME requirements, don't explicitly say so. So I had a lot of trouble figuring that out. But for the most part, you can look at it on the state webpage. Okay, anything else in there so far? And John is actually right, now that I've actually had time to realize that, to read this. The amount of funding that you get for CME, particularly going to meetings, can frequently be negotiated as part of your job. And that can either be explicit cash funding, or it can simply be that they support your time. Oh. When did that happen? All right, moving on. Hospital credentialing. This is a fairly short topic, but there's a couple of important points to make here. So if you want to practice in a hospital, if you're going to be a hospitalist, or if you are going to admit patients to the hospital as a generalist, or if you need to do procedures that require a hospital facility, which actually a surprising number of procedures don't, but if you're planning on doing things in the hospital, you will need to be credentialed in that hospital. The reason why I say a surprising number of procedures don't is if, for example, you are a gastroenterologist and you own your own endoscopy suite, you can actually do endoscopies there without privileges. But if the hospital owns your endoscopy suite, then you're going to need privileges. So most of you are actually going to want to have hospital privileges for one reason or another. And for many of us, that is because we are salaried physicians. So even though I work in an outpatient clinic, the building is actually owned by the hospital, and therefore I have to be privileged by UW-Medicine. But if you own your own facility and you don't practice within the walls of a hospital, you don't actually necessarily need privileges. And many of you may have become aware of this in this recent debate over abortion, where some of the states that are trying to restrict abortions are requiring people to have privileges in a hospital, which actually was a significant barrier for a lot of the people who practice at places like Planned Parenthood, where privileges aren't required. So that was the most recent time this came up in the news. Generally, when you're getting privileged, there will be a background check that's pretty similar to licensure. Usually they'll ask for attestations from your colleagues. That's a little different. in the sense that the licensing boards usually just ask you to attest to all this stuff, whereas hospitals will frequently ask you to identify 3 or 4 people who they can ask about your professionalism and your clinical skills. And then they will sometimes ask for a letter from the residency program saying that you are in good standing. That's usually not a big issue. The one place that it can be an issue is when you start talking about procedures. Hospitals have variable standards in terms of what procedures they expect you to be competent in as part of general credentialing. So for example, at University of Washington, when you apply for general inpatient privileges, you are also applying for thoracentesis privileges and paracentesis privileges, but central venous catheters are actually a separate credential. Conscious sedation is a separate credential. So when you're applying for hospital privileges, you need to look and see what's rolled in and what are separate things that you would have to apply for separately. If you are applying for a specific credential that you are signed off on here when you leave residency, and the hospital doesn't specify a number, then we will attest that you are competent in that. So let's say you have done the required number of IJs and the hospital says, is this person competent in central venous catheters? We will say, yes, they are competent in IJ CVCs. If they have a specific number, then that will go to whether or not you've done enough of those procedures and logged enough of those procedures. By and large, most hospitals are not asking for specific numbers. They are asking for just general, is this person competent? And some hospitals don't ask us about procedures at all. But I just wanted you to be aware of that. If there are procedures that are important to your future, especially if you are a second-year resident and have time to catch up on this and you're not signed off, it would be a good idea to get signed off just in case hospitals ask in the future whether or not you are competent to practice those procedures. And it would be a good idea to continue to log them in case the hospitals want a specific number that is higher than we do. I'm gonna pause there, and if there's any questions about that, because I know that's a stress point, feel free to either chat them or unmute and ask. And I'm gonna read Yodit's comment. I don't know the answer to your question, Yodit. I don't have any inside contents. Megan, when you are not signed off on procedures that are grouped in with hospital privileges, then what you need to do is tell the hospital that. And what usually they'll let you do is just do a line through that procedure. And then once you get there, they typically expect you to do some kind of makeup work so that you can be credentialed in the procedure. That is okay with most hospitals. It's not a deal breaker for employment. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? All right. On to subspecialty boards. You can put in more questions later if they come up. So specialty boards and being board certified. Okay, so criteria for initial certification. I'm hoping all of the R3s are intimately familiar with this. R2s, this might be news to you, but hopefully it's not surprising. You have to finish residency. Some of you are almost there. That is what makes you board eligible. So when you're looking at job offers and you see this thing that says BCBE, that is short for board certified or board eligible. And the reason why board eligible matters is because people know that you're not going to be board certified until later this year at the earliest, and they want to be able to offer you a job before you are actually certified. Almost all of those board eligible positions are expecting you to get certified in a timely fashion. You need to do that, and you need to pass the board exam. If there are any of you who need to register this fall and haven't, believe it or not, they extended the deadline. You have until tomorrow. So get your $1,500 together and get it in. But I'm hoping that all of the R3s are already signed up for a date. The exam dates are still on. As far as we know, the Pearson VUE centers are open. And that is where that is. I want to show you one thing that's new data. This is from a paper that actually just got published ahead of print last month in Academic Medicine. I didn't see it until I was prepping this talk. And what this is this is looking at the IMITE score, which is down here on the x-axis. So this is your ITE score. This is the probability of passing the board certifying exam. So this is, to me, the most relevant line. If you scored above 75% on the ITE, your chances of passing the boards are almost 100%. Now, caveat, this did not account for whether or not people studied. So we can probably assume that even the people above 75% did study for boards. I don't think you should necessarily take your ITE score above 75 and assume that means that you shouldn't study. But I think if you study the amount that you normally would for a standardized test, your chances of passing are very, very good. The other numbers that I think are worth looking at are, if you look at like, what's the 95% pass rate? So for R3s and R2s, it's a little different because R3s you expect R3s to get higher scores on the test. So if you're an R3 and your score was 70 or above, you're still at 95+%. And if you're an R2, that's 65 that puts you at 95+% of passing. So the good news is most of you, not all of you, but most of you fall into this group where you really, really, really shouldn't stress about the ABIM exam. You should study the amount that you would normally study for something like this and not sweat bullets. If you are not in one of those higher end groups, then you probably should study for the ABM exam. You're still overwhelmingly likely to pass. I mean, if you go down here, you know, there are very few of you who are scoring down in this range, but it's a pretty steep curve when you start getting in between 40 and 60. So that will be hopefully reassuring to many of you. Once you have passed boards, once you have gotten your initial certificate and you are out there practicing medicine, the board is not done with you. Maintenance of certification is, by board standards, a relatively new thing, meaning that it's new within the last 20 years or so. That for the ABIM is still new. And it is something that they have continued to change year over year because it is wildly unpopular with ABIM diplomates, is what they call those of us who have that certificate somewhere on our wall. I'm giving you the current version. I'm not going to get into the past history here, although there's plenty of it if you want to look. So the key thing to know, MOC actually begins as soon as your initial certificate is issued. You are automatically signed up for MOC, and they waive your fee for, if you're a fellow, they waive your fee for your entire fellowship, so you're just kind of in the program. You're also getting 20 points per year for being a fellow. So to a degree, that is very helpful for those of you who are doing fellowships. It also sort of helps to keep the validity of the program because they recognize that nobody doing a fellowship is going to be dealing with this. So they just sort of auto-enroll you. The thing they don't do is they don't, well, they actually do. Yeah, they waive your fellow. So they just kind of, you're good if you're a fellow. If you're a general internist and you're not going on to fellowship, they still give you a fee waiver for the first year, sort of trying to keep people in the fold. The other key thing about MOC, which is a little weird, there are actually two different levels of certification from the ABIM. So all of you will be board certified as soon as you pass your board exams, and all of you will initially be participating in MOC. But the participating in MOC is actually a higher standard, and it's intended to represent that you're doing ongoing work to maintain your certificate. And you may ask, well, why not just say certified? And the reason why is because there are still people in practice who have non-time limited board certificates, who took their boards like 30 years ago, and they are board certified until they die. And because ABIM wanted to incentivize these people to participate in the MOC program, they created this second tier of participating in MOC. For the overwhelming majority of us who have taken our boards in the last 30-ish years, if we don't participate in MOC, eventually we are no longer certified. So to clarify that, and that includes everyone on this call, I assume, to clarify that, to remain certified, what you have to do is you have to accumulate 100 points of MOC activities every 5 years. 1 point of MOC is roughly equivalent to 1 hour of CME. And you can either do that, you can do that with free things through the ABIM. So they have these online courses and modules that you can do that are typically worth about 10 points. You can get CME from a lot of, or get MOC from a lot of CME conferences. So for example, ACP's annual meeting, SGIM's meeting, our Washington chapter meeting all offer MOC as part of the meeting. There are also frequently activities where you go through an ABIM module together. I'm going to be doing one of those this fall, where you all earn MOC points. You can also get them from Up to Date. This is probably how most of you will be getting most of your MOC points. Again, use your own login, and then when you're done, you can submit those for MOC points. And if you don't get more than 100 of those every 5 years, you are way smarter than I am, because I'm in Up to Date way more than that. The other thing that you have to do is you have to do some kind of assessment every 10 years. Now, historically, that was a great big test, kind of similar to, but shorter than the initial certifying exam. The ABIM has actually created a lot of interesting new options. There is now an every 2-year open book test that you can take. They are actually working on a thing where they are kind of sending out, like, you can almost think of them as practice mix-up questions, but they're not actually practice questions. Every couple of years, and I'll come back to that, but those are like 100 questions a year. I don't think that's actually immediately relevant to you because you guys are all actually covered for 10 years by your initial board exam. So you don't have to worry about taking another test for 10 years from now or from whenever you take boards. If you want to be participating in MOC, then what you have to do is you have to do something every 2 years. So the difference is if you do one thing in 2 years and then rack up 500 or rack up 100 points in 5 years, you're great. If you don't even look at MOC for 2 years, then after 2 years, you're going to be reported as no longer participating. So just kind of going through an example here just to try and illustrate this. So let's assume you pass boards this fall. Your fees are waived for a year, but starting in 2022, they're going to expect you to pay $165 or whatever it is then per year to participate in MOC. If you don't do anything after that, then in 2023, you're going to be reported as no longer participating in MOC, but you'll still be certified. And then in 2025, if you don't do anything, then the board will no longer report you as being certified. If you do enough to stay certified, then you're good until 2030, but come 2030, you're going to need to take some kind of a test. So that's kind of how it shapes up. And I expect that by 2030, the testing options are going to be different than they are now. I don't think you need to drill down into them. John, I appreciate you took the open book test in February. I'm scheduled for it in July. It's really not that bad. I anticipate the thing where they send us 10 mix-up questions a month, although they're obviously not mix-up because that's a different product. But they're basically 10 questions a month, supposedly with immediate feedback. I think that'll be fine too. But by the time it's relevant to almost all of the rest of you, it's going to be different. Couple of other notes on MOC because there's a couple of specific pathways that many of you need to know about. There is a thing called focused practice in hospital medicine, which is basically the result of the hospitalists lobbying the board and convincing them that they are special. This is something you need to know about not immediately because you actually have to be 3 years out from residency in order to be eligible to apply. So you're not going to be applying next year. But if you enter hospital medicine practice, and you have a minimum number of inpatient encounters. So this is the thing that's kind of unique to the hospital medicine thing is you have to have at least 1,000 inpatient encounters per year, and some senior hospital officer, i.e. your boss, has to attest to that for you. There's a side pathway where if you're doing mostly QI work, you can have fewer than that. But for people who are just seeing patients, it's 1,000 per year. And then what you get for doing that is you get to take a different test that is focused on hospital medicine. So they will no longer ask you about boutonniere deformities, although apparently Lauren Ring knows about these things. But they will ask you questions relevant to hospitalists, and the recertification exam will have less outpatient medicine on it. So in general, it's probably a good thing if you are a hospitalist and if you meet their number of encounter requirements. If for some reason it doesn't work out for you, you can actually revert to taking the general IM test whenever you want. So that's a thing created solely for hospitalists. The other thing to know, for those of you who are going to be specialists, because you are even specialer, is if you're a fellow, you get basically what you need to stay accredited in MOC, including a fee waiver for the duration of your fellowship, plus 20 additional bonus points. So for as long as you are in an ACGME accredited fellowship, then you're covered. Now keep in mind, some fellowships are not ACGME accredited, in which case they're going to treat you as any other general internist. But if you're in an accredited program, then you're covered while you're in fellowship. Once you are certified in your subspecialty, generally speaking, you only need to earn the MOC points in your specialty. So if you do all of your MOC points in your specialty, they will apply those to your general IM certificate. So you don't have to do a bunch of like update in hospital medicine points if you're a cardiologist. You still do need to do whatever the test is that you're going to take for general internal medicine if you want to keep your internal medicine boards. So that can be the every 10-year test, every 2-year test, whatever it is. And then if your subspecialty has a procedural requirement, you have to stay up on that procedural requirement. So basically you have to remain certified in the specialty and then take the test in general IM to stay dual boarded. And then just a quick blurb on why do we even put up with all this stuff? John's like, MOC can be confusing. Yes. So the reasons why I think this is important, you have put a ridiculous amount of work into getting this certificate. So, you know, come September when you get that letter from the board saying you're a board certified internist, you should be proud of yourself. It is worth doing the MOC stuff to keep that. MOC is a huge pain in the ass, but it's way better than losing your board certificate. It also matters because a lot of employers require that you remain board certified to keep your job. Most employers do not currently distinguish between participating in MOC and certified. With the current state of affairs, you probably can slack off for that 5-year window and then make up all your 100 points in the last year if you want to, and nothing bad will happen to you. That said, with the bar for participating is so low, do one thing in 2 years that I would encourage you to stay participating. And the reason why is because if you're practicing here, that gets you off the CME hook. So I don't worry about CME credits. I do submit them, I do record them, but I don't need to account for them because I'm participating in MOC, and that's all I need. And I plan on continuing to participate in MOC. So those are kind of that's my spiel on boards, and I do not work for the ABIM, never have. Okay, so the take-home points. Please apply for state licenses early. Use the uniform application if you can, it will save you work later. Remember that licensure compact if you're planning on moving from state to state, that could potentially save you a ton of time in reapplying. CME requirements are state specific. The first thing you need to look at is whether your state accepts MOC in lieu of CME, which will make your life much easier. If they don't, just know what those requirements are and do the accounting to meet them. Plan on getting your knowledge at the point of care. Most of what you do is going to be looking things up because you have a question about a specific patient. That is fine. That is the way that practice works. Just be sure that you get credit when credit's available for that. The real purpose behind CME meetings is networking. It is not so you can learn what they are teaching you. It is so that you can meet the people who are teaching you that stuff. That is true for things like ACP, and that is true for professional society meetings. It is really much more about meeting and having FaceTime with your colleagues. Hopefully these things will start happening again because that is hard to do. That is hard to replace by Zoom. As John said, MOC is confusing. It is annoyingly complicated. It is actually not that hard to do. My advice to those of you who are taking boards this fall is to just remember sometime in the next year, log back into abim.org, look at what they need you to do, mark on your calendar when they need you to pay them because that's going to be important, and then just get the ball rolling. It is really not that hard, and it's just a little bit annoying. Okay, that is all I have to say about that. Do people have questions, things that I have not answered? Nothing yet in the chat. And yeah, John makes a good take-home point. Kelly is not going to be keeping track of your life anymore. That is up to you yourselves or anyone else that you can manage to farm that out to. See Megan's question about procedures above. Yeah, I tried to answer that on the fly. Basically, if you are not signed off on a procedure that is grouped in, if you are applying for privileges at a hospital and you are not signed off on a procedure that is part of that hospital's privileging, what you need to do is let the hospital know that you are not applying for that privilege. And that typically involves something as 19th century as drawing a line through it on the form you're filling out and initialing it and then sending it back. But please do not apply for procedures that you are not signed off on and expect us to say it's okay. Oh, that's a smart thing from John. If you need to get a notarized copy, have them do a couple more notarizations. Yeah, that's a great idea. And honestly, if you anticipate being in a position where you're going to need notarized copy after notarized copy, like the scenario I was thinking of is if you do fellowship in one place and then you go somewhere else to do, and you know you're going to practice somewhere other than where you're doing your fellowship, that may be a place where that certification service is worth the $400. Yeah. So Alice, if you sign up with the credentials verification service, you can actually send that to any state whenever you want. And the way that that works is when you sign up initially, it's that $375 upfront fee, and that includes sending reports to one state. And then if you want to send a report to a state later, it basically costs $100. I think they're winding down. No, you can actually sign up for FCVS whenever you want, and then you can just add additional credentials. The thing you can't do until you're board certified is that interstate licensure compact where you kind of, it has the speed licensing. So that is one where if you are applying for a license in another state right now, you have to go through the full process. But next year when you're board certified, that should be much easier. Anything else? Going once, going twice? Okay, y'all, it's been fun. Send me emails if you want. Thanks, John. And I will catch y'all out there. Let's see. I'm going
Thank you, Chris. That was great.
You bet, Sarah. See you later.
If there are any interns still on here, Gabby should send out a link for intern core teaching conference today, i.e. intern mega report. I see a few folks still on here. So make sure at 11 you guys go join that. Otherwise, that's all we got for academic half day, and I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.